Ele é editor do blog Live Journal sobre teoria política e filosofia. Ele é fundador e presidente do Seasteading Institute, que é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos, que tem como missão justamente promover o desenvolvimento de comunidades autônomas permanentes no oceano. Por favor, aplaudam aí o Patri Friedman.
Thank you. All right, well, this is going to be a bit of a different talk, but that's good, right? Because diversity reduces risk. So whether or not I manage to convince you that floating cities are the best way to increase freedom, which may be kind of hard, I hope to at least convince you that the freedom movement is overinvested in academics rather than entrepreneurship and in arguing with people rather than showing them examples. So that's what I'll try to do. All right, so what's the structure of this talk going to be? First, I'll kind of explain the basic premise of seasteading, mostly without referring to libertarianism, because it's an idea that works for everyone. It's an idea that appeals even beyond libertarians. And then I'll talk about some of the implications for libertarians, about kind of the contrast between the approach of complaining about government and the approach of trying to compete with it, and why I think my way is better. Big surprise. And then I'm going to talk about the organization I founded, the Seasteading Institute, because ideas matter, but ideas alone are not enough. We need to put ideas into practice, and I'll talk about the concrete steps that we're trying to do that. What I won't talk about very much is morality or the morality of government or political parties. Instead, I kind of view government as a product where citizens are customers, they pay taxes, they get certain services in return for their taxes, not usually very good ones, but some. Or alternately, I view government as a technology. So it's a set of rules and processes. I mean, what is a set of laws but a list of instructions for how to decide who's right or wrong in a legal case, or what you're going to do in a certain circumstance? And a set of rules or instructions is basically a technology. All right, so why take this approach? What I'm trying to do is to get us to think about politics with our rational brains, our uniquely human higher thinking skills, rather than with our limbic system, center of emotion, or our reptilian brain, or even lower parts below the brain entirely. I think that our kind of tribal emotions get in the way of understanding what's really wrong with government, that we see everything as a battle of us against them. It's kind of trying to expand our movement until it's big enough to take over the tribe, and that's really not a useful way to think. Instead, I think that we should figure out the incentives of government and try to improve them. If you haven't seen this picture before, this is North Korea and South Korea at night. You'll notice one is a little brighter than the other. These two places didn't start with different types of people, with a different culture, or with different resources. They just chose very different government technologies. They chose very different systems of rules, and they got very different outcomes. And one of the things that's been happening in economics in a field called institutional economics is economists realizing that rules and institutions are really important in productivity and growth, maybe even the most important. Economists used to think it was about resources and accumulating capital. Instead, if you look at the statistical regressions, it looks like resources may even be a negative, because countries that have a lot of resources set up elites that try to control access to those resources and just kind of rent-seek. They just live off of the access, say, to the oil, whereas a country without resources has to create value in order to have value. So systems of rules matter a lot. And in fact, this is kind of non-intuitive, but they matter more than things like education or intelligence, which many of us intuit matter the most. If you move a worker from Mexico to the US, their productivity increases by about a factor of 5, much more than, say, the difference between a high school dropout and a PhD, or someone with an IQ of 100 versus an IQ of 130. So what system of rules we have and what system of rules people live under, it matters a lot to long-run growth. So Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other ones we've tried. And to some people, this is the end of the story. But I think it's the beginning. After all, most possible systems of government, most sets of rules, most legal systems, most constitutions have not been tried yet. If we imagine that this room was the space of all possible legal systems, every little point in this room represents some government, what have we tried? Maybe, I don't know, this much? Maybe a space the size of me? Very little. What's the chance that the best possible government has already been tried? It's almost zero. Another argument is, unless you think that there's some country which is better than all other countries at everything, unless that's true, which I don't think it is, then you should believe that if we took the best ideas from each country, the best parts of each constitution, we could make something better than anything that we have today. And finally, to argue that government can get better than it is now, I'll make the technological progress argument. So there's an old joke about the U.S. Constitution which says, you know, it's not great, but it's better than what America uses now. And I agree, but it's far from the best that we can do. I mean, what's the chance that in all of the advances in psychology and economics and computers that we've had since the U.S. Constitution was written, what's the chance that none of them affect what the best system of rules is? Basically, zero. And let me just give you a quick example to illustrate this. So many countries today use a representative democracy where you get together in elections every couple of years and you vote for representatives for a whole geographic region. What if instead anybody could pick the representative from anyone else, and you could change your representative based on the issue? Maybe you log into some website and you say, on these issues, I trust this think tank. On these issues, I trust this person. Or maybe on these issues, I want to vote myself. And every morning, the list of things comes up, and your computer tells you which things you need to vote on or which things you've already set a filter that will decide who votes. I think this system would be better than a democracy where you vote every couple of years because you get much better feedback. In the current system, a representative can give you one thing that you really want so that you vote for him, and then screw you over on everything else. In this system, they couldn't do that. Will the system work? I don't know. But it's an example of a system that's enabled by brand new technology that was not possible when most of the countries today were founded. So one thing, if government is a technology, there's something like really strange going on, right? Because we've come to expect something from our technologies, that they get better all the time. You know, how often do we throw out our cell phones nowadays? Every couple of years? How often do we throw out our computers? All right, how often do we throw out our governments? Really not very often. Why not? What's different about government that it doesn't just keep getting better and better, that we don't keep coming up with new ways for social organization? You know, some people will say, well, government isn't good because those guys in Congress are really bad, or we chose the wrong president, or we have the wrong monetary system. And I don't think that any of these are the answer. Not because they pick the wrong people to back or the wrong laws, but they're at entirely the wrong level. That is, that the questions we should be asking are not what is the best policy, but what systems tend to pick good policies, and how can we get in the real world systems that tend to generate good policies. The way that I view politics is sort of at three levels of emergent behavior, or three levels of spontaneous order. One is policies, a specific rule like the minimum wage. Another is political systems like representative democracy or proxyable democracy or monarchy or anarcho-capitalism. And at the highest level, what is the industry of all of the governments in the world as firms, and how do they compete for customers, and how do customers pick them? We tend to talk the most in politics about policies, about rules, about what should the minimum wage be or should we have one? What should the monetary system be? But I've come to think that this is just not very useful. That what matters is not what the best possible rule would be, but what rules do they pick in Brasilia? Are those the best possible rules? I think not. So which political systems we have really influences which rules we get. And I'm really glad that my dad's talking in a little bit, because he's going to talk about anarcho-capitalism and why we should expect to get better rules from it. And I'm going to briefly talk about democracy and why we should expect to get not so great rules from it. So I'll start with a little toy example. Raise your hand if you've heard of the hoteling model, one-dimensional model of voter preference. Not too many. Okay, this will be fun. I want 2 volunteers on stage. This will be quick. All right. Imagine that this stage is a one-dimensional axis of politics, left, right, say. And each of you are political candidates who can position yourself wherever you want on the stage. Now, voters are very simple. They will choose whoever is closest to their beliefs. So voters are spread out along this whole stage, and they'll just go vote for whoever's closest to them. I want you to stand so that you try to get the most voters. Right now, all these guys are with you. Those guys in the middle are kind of half with you. Oh, you're getting more. Now he's getting more than you. Now he's getting more than you. Oh, now he's getting more. You better do something. You better change. You can move around on the stage. Only sideways, not forward or back. You can move around. Okay, now it's closer to 50-50. You can go around him if you need to. Now it's closer. Okay, now it's about 50-50. Okay, good. Now what if either of you tried to move? Could you do better? If you went around him, oh, it'll still be about 50-50. Yeah. If you went around him, still, okay, good. You found it. Thank you. So what happened? That's a simple model called the hoteling model, which says that if you have a political system where people will vote for whoever's beliefs are closest to theirs, which kind of makes sense and can be modeled with one axis, that the parties will choose the median. The median, mathematically, is the place that splits all the voters in two. This was not designed. All right? Here's what's important, is it wasn't like someone said, well, I think in a democracy, the political parties should position themselves to split the voters in two. I mean, if we were going to choose a simple way to combine everybody's different politics into one, I think that I would choose the average mathematically, because the average reflects everyone's opinions. If you have an average, if somebody moves, the average moves. But this median, it throws out most of the info. It says we just want to split people. The people here could move way over there, and the median wouldn't move. Now, I'm giving this example not because I think it represents what's wrong with democracy, but just because it's so simple and it's so easy to see how this certain structure of rules gives you a certain predictable outcome just because that's the logic of it. That's not what was intended. This happens in democracy too, unfortunately. So I'm going to do my best to give you the 2-minute explanation of what's wrong with democracy. And you should go read Manker Olson if you want, the 200-page explanation. So there are about 200 million people in Brazil. I want you to imagine some law which would cost everyone in Brazil $1. It would cost every one of you $1. Now, this law, unfortunately, benefits certain special parties. There are 100 people in Brazil who, instead of losing $1 from this law, each make $1 million. What is the net social result of this law? 200 million people each lose $1. That's a loss of $200 million. 100 people each gain $1 million. That's a gain of $100 million. So this has a net social cost of 200 million minus 100 million. It's a $100 million loss for the country in a utilitarian sense. I guarantee you this law will pass. Every time. In fact, I kind of look at democracy as a system for passing laws like this. Why?